At Pearl Harbor, Japan shocked the world with fire and precision, leaving battleships burning and America reeling. For a moment, it seemed the Pacific belonged to the rising Sunday. Yet within 3 years, that shock had shifted. On remote islands and distant beaches, it was Japanese commanders who stared in disbelief as an enemy they had mocked revealed a terrifying new face. Fleets of ships moved as one, waves of aircraft struck in perfect rhythm, and landings unfolded with impossible precision. This was not the confused America they expected, but a machine of war unlike anything seen before, a force whose true power was only beginning to be understood. The morning mist clung to the dense jungle canopy of Guadalcanal like a shroud. It was August 7th, 1942. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, a proud graduate of the Imperial Japanese Army Academy, stood at his concealed observation post, binoculars in hand. Only months earlier, he had celebrated Japan's string of amphibious victories across Asia and the Pacific. From the fall of the Philippines to the swift seizure of Singapore, Japanese forces had perfected the art of landing troops where no enemy thought possible. They had executed 29 successful amphibious operations, from the coasts of China to the islands of the Dutch East Indies, with an efficiency that shocked the Western world. Ichiki's worldview was simple, forged by both doctrine and personal pride. The Americans were clumsy at sea. They built ships in vast numbers. Yes, but coordination, precision, warrior spirit? The Japanese army believed American landings would be disorderly, plagued by hesitation and confusion. A few well-placed counterattacks, Ichiki thought, would send them fleeing. Then the silence broke. A lookout shouted, his voice sharp in the humid air. "Ships! American ships on the horizon!" Ichiki raised his Zeiss binoculars, expecting perhaps a dozen transports, maybe a small, reckless reconnaissance force. What filled his lenses froze him where he stood. The horizon was thick with silhouettes, transports, destroyers, cruisers, battleships. Hundreds of them, stretching so far across the Pacific horizon, they seemed to bend with the curvature of the earth. Later, he would write in his report that the armada extended beyond the limits of sight. They did not move like a mob of ships hastily gathered. They moved in formation precise, geometric formations that turned the open ocean into something resembling a parade ground. The sight was alien, unsettling. For a moment, Ichiki's confidence cracked. Panic rippled through Japanese communications networks on Guadalcanal. Observation posts reported the same, unbelievable figure: over 800 ships. Repeat, over 800 ships. The voice of one young officer, relayed over the crackling radio, carried an edge of hysteria. To the men on the island, it felt as though the entire American Navy had materialized overnight, summoned from the industrial heart of the continent. Ichiki lowered his binoculars. He had studied at the Imperial Naval Academy. He knew amphibious warfare. He had lived through Japan's expansion, from Manchuria in the early 1930s to the conquest of the Philippines. He knew what a landing should look like: confusion, hesitation, mistakes. What he saw before him was the opposite. The Americans were moving like clockwork. Destroyer escorts peeled off from the formation in mathematically perfect arcs, taking up positions to shield the lumbering transports. Aircraft appeared overhead, not scattered and ragged, but in immaculate V formations, their wings gleaming in the morning sunday. As he watched, landing craft were lowered into the water, dozens at a time, each released in rhythm, creating waves of small boats that surged toward the shore with uncanny timing. This was not the America described in Tokyo's intelligence briefings. This was not the bumbling, soft industrial giant that supposedly lacked the spirit for war. This was something terrifyingly new. Ichiki's aide approached, notebook in hand. "Sir, your instructions." For the first time in his career, Ichiki hesitated. The traditions of his samurai ancestors weighed on him, the legacy of discipline, sacrifice, and the unshakable belief in Japan's superiority. Yet as the American fleet drew closer, every assumption he carried was crumbling. The opening bombardment began. Naval guns thundered in unison, not sporadically, not haphazardly, but in carefully calculated patterns. Shells landed with deadly accuracy, lifting and shifting their fire exactly as landing craft approached the beaches. American airstrikes swept in overhead, timed to the second, their bombs falling as the naval gunfire shifted, ensuring no pause in the destruction. Ichiki's men, crouched in their foxholes, felt the earth tremble beneath them. Some whispered prayers, others clenched their rifles tighter. They had been told the Americans lacked the discipline to fight like this. Yet here they were, executing a choreography of destruction that no Japanese officer had imagined possible. The background to this moment was critical. When Ichiki watched the horizon fill with American steel, he was witnessing not only the first major U.S. offensive in the Pacific, but also the debut of a new doctrine born from bitter lessons. After Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps had been humiliated. Their early defeats at Wake Island and the Philippines reinforced Japanese beliefs in American weakness. But behind the scenes, a transformation was underway. The U.S. Navy established specialized training centers in places like San Diego and Norfolk, drilling crews relentlessly in joint operations. New communication technologies, including portable radios and standardized signal protocols, were tested and refined. The Marine Corps created detailed amphibious manuals, breaking down each element of a landing into precise steps. And, perhaps most important, American industry produced specialized landing craft, the Higgins boats, and amphibious tractors known as LVTs, designed to overcome reefs, shallows, and other obstacles that had crippled past landings. By the summer of 1942, these innovations had been forged into a doctrine: amphibious assault as a synchronized ballet of sea, air, and land power. Ichiki's personal stake in this battle was profound. His family name traced back centuries to samurai who had served the Tokugawa shogunate. His father had died in the Russo-Japanese War. His son, barely 16, dreamed of becoming a naval aviator. For Ichiki, victory was more than military necessity, it was cultural destiny. To admit weakness in the face of American coordination was to admit that the very foundation of Japanese superiority was flawed. And yet, the evidence was undeniable. American forces poured ashore in disciplined waves. Naval gunfire lifted with precision. Air support arrived at the exact moments it was needed. Marine units secured beachheads, while Army artillery was already being positioned inland. Supply vessels maneuvered toward predetermined zones, their cargo unloaded by crews who seemed to operate on the same clock. Ichiki whispered to himself, "Impossible." But it was happening. The lessons of Guadalcanal echoed through both Tokyo and Washington. For the Japanese, it was a bitter realization that the Americans were not the disorganized, soft adversaries they had imagined. For the United States, it was proof that amphibious doctrine carefully nurtured in manuals and war games could work under fire. But the next test would come on the tiny coral atoll of Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands in November 1943. Tarawa was only a sliver of land, barely 3 miles long and less than a mile wide, yet it bristled with Japanese defenses. Over 4,000 Japanese troops, many of them hardened veterans, fortified the beaches with bunkers, trenches, and interlocking fields of fire. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, commander of the garrison, boasted that 1,000,000 men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. It was a statement destined to become infamous. When dawn broke on November 20th, the Americans launched what was then the largest amphibious assault in history. The 2nd Marine Division surged toward Tarawa, supported by battleships, cruisers, and aircraft carriers. The pre-invasion bombardment was intense. Over 3 million pounds of shells and bombs rained down on the island. Observers believed nothing could survive, but when the Marines hit the beaches, Japanese machine guns and artillery opened up with terrifying precision. The reason lay in the tides. Miscalculations had left landing craft stranded on coral reefs, hundreds of yards from shore. Marines were forced to wade through waist-deep water under withering fire, their equipment dragging them down as bullets whipped past. Many never reached the sand. Others collapsed in the surf, shot before they could lift their rifles. It was chaos. The very chaos Ichiki had expected at Guadalcanal, but with a difference. This time, chaos did not break the Americans. Through sheer determination and discipline, the Marines pressed forward. Amphibious tractors, the LVTs known as alligators, crawled across the reefs and deposited troops directly onto the beaches. These ungainly vehicles, ridiculed before the war, now proved decisive. They carried Marines over obstacles that would have made a traditional landing impossible. Naval gunfire shifted with precision, blasting Japanese strongpoints identified by forward observers. Carrier aircraft swooped in, strafing pillboxes only yards ahead of advancing Marines. Slowly, methodically, the Americans clawed their way inland. Every yard of sand was paid for in blood. By the end of the first day, casualties were staggering. Nearly 1,000 Marines lay dead, with 2,000 more wounded. The beaches were littered with bodies, the water stained red. Some correspondents, witnessing the carnage, questioned whether the island could ever be taken. But by the third day, American coordination began to turn the tide. Infantry advances were synchronized with tank movements. Engineers demolished bunkers with satchel charges, timed with supporting fire. Airstrikes were called in with precision unheard of only a year earlier. The Marines were no longer fighting alone. They were part of a vast, coordinated machine that stretched from the beaches to the battleships offshore, and the carriers beyond the horizon. On November 23rd, Tarawa fell. Admiral Shibasaki had been killed on the first day, cut off by bombardment. Of the 4,500 Japanese defenders, only 17 survived. The price was terrible. Over 1,000 Americans dead, 2,000 wounded. Yet the United States had achieved what Shibasaki declared impossible. And in only 76 hours, Tarawa was a crucible. It revealed flaws in American planning, especially in tidal calculations and underestimation of defenses. But it also proved the resilience of the new doctrine. Coordination had carried the day, turning what could have been a disaster into a brutal victory. The lessons of Tarawa were burned into the memory of every planner and commander. They would not be forgotten when the next great assault came. June 15th, 1944. The island of Saipan in the Marianas became the stage for one of the most decisive moments of the Pacific War. It was here that Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the architect of Pearl Harbor, stood in his bunker and watched a spectacle that shattered his faith in Japan's naval supremacy. The American Fifth Fleet, commanded by Admiral Raymond Spruance, approached with an armada of 800 ships. It was the largest invasion force yet assembled in the Pacific. Battleships that Nagumo had once crippled at Pearl Harbor steamed toward his defenses, repaired, modernized, and bristling with firepower. The USS Pennsylvania, the USS Maryland, the USS Tennessee vessels he believed destroyed now returned as ghosts, symbols of America's refusal to die. At exactly 5:45 in the morning, the bombardment began. Not approximately, but exactly every ship opening fire within seconds of each other along a 15-mile battle line. The precision was uncanny. It was as if the entire fleet moved according to a single heartbeat. Radio intercepts stunned Nagumo's staff. American naval gunfire was being directed by aircraft spotters and ground observers who had not even landed yet. Airstrikes were timed to lift fire the moment landing craft reached the beaches. Supply vessels were maneuvering toward assigned zones, while the first waves were still in motion. The coordination was beyond anything Nagumo had ever imagined. As the first waves hit the shore, the choreography continued. Infantry came first, supported by engineers. Then armor, rolling off landing craft with uncanny timing. Then artillery, establishing positions exactly where the next phase required them. Every movement fit into a larger design. To the Japanese defenders, it seemed as if the Americans anticipated their every response. By noon, Marine units had already broken through positions expected to hold for weeks. Japanese counterattacks were met, not just with resistance, but with overwhelming integrated force. Tanks, infantry, naval gunfire, and air support converging in perfect unison. Night infiltration tactics, once a Japanese specialty, collapsed under the Americans' use of radar-guided illumination rounds and coordinated reserves. Nagumo's staff watched in disbelief. "Their casualties are light," one report said. "They are moving toward the airstrip with little resistance." The realization struck Nagumo with crushing weight. At Pearl Harbor, he had commanded 6 carriers with perfect planning. Now he watched 800 American ships perform something even more remarkable. Not a surprise attack, but an open, daylight assault executed with machine-like precision. In his final report, Nagumo confessed the unthinkable. The Americans had surpassed Japan. They had not only matched Japan's coordination, they had revolutionized it. Within weeks of Saipan's fall, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo resigned. The Japanese government shifted from dreams of expansion to desperate defense. And Emperor Hirohito, reviewing the reports, admitted privately for the first time, victory might be impossible. Saipan was not just a battle. It was the revelation that the Pacific War had entered a new phase. From that point on, Japanese officers no longer underestimated American coordination. They feared it. The fall of Saipan in June 1944 was not just a military defeat. It was an earthquake that shook the Japanese command structure to its core. For the first time, Japanese leaders admitted privately that their assumptions about American weakness were catastrophically wrong. Reports poured in describing American coordination that seemed almost supernatural: naval gunfire, synchronized with airstrikes, infantry moving as if guided by a single hand, supply lines functioning under fire with industrial efficiency. Among those reading the reports was Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, a man unlike many of his peers. Born into a samurai family in Nagano Prefecture, Kuribayashi had trained not only in Japan, but also in the United States. In the early 1930s, he served as a military attaché in Washington, traveling widely across the American heartland. He visited Ford factories in Detroit, steel mills in Pittsburgh, and sprawling farms in the Midwest. He rode cross-country trains and marveled at the sheer size of the nation. He wrote home with a sobering conclusion: "The United States is a sleeping giant. If it wakes, no one will stop it." Those words, dismissed by his superiors at the time, now seemed prophetic. When Kuribayashi was assigned to command the defense of Iwo Jima in May 1944, he knew the Americans would come. And he knew they would come not as clumsy amateurs, but as masters of coordination. Kuribayashi studied the reports from Saipan and other battles with forensic intensity. He noted how American naval gunfire was adjusted by forward observers in real time. He read how airstrikes lifted at the precise moment landing craft touched the beaches. He examined diagrams showing the waves of American infantry, armor, and artillery moving in synchronization. To fight the Americans with traditional tactics, charging into the surf with bayonets, staging desperate banzai attacks was suicide. He resolved to rewrite Japanese defensive doctrine. On Iwo Jima, a barren volcanic island shaped like a pork chop, Kuribayashi created a defense unlike any the Americans had yet faced. He ordered the construction of an underground fortress, 11 miles of tunnels, caves, and bunkers carved into the volcanic rock. Artillery was concealed in camouflaged positions, connected by tunnels that allowed guns to be moved after firing. Machine gun nests were placed not on the beaches, where naval bombardment could destroy them, but inland, covering likely approach routes. Most radical of all, Kuribayashi forbade the traditional banzai charges that had defined Japanese resistance in earlier battles. He knew the Americans' coordination would annihilate such attacks. Instead, he ordered his men to fight from concealed positions, trading space for time, inflicting maximum casualties through attrition. The goal was not to win, victory was impossible, but to bleed the Americans so heavily that public opinion might force negotiations. In one of his letters home, Kuribayashi wrote with chilling clarity, "I will not survive this battle, but I will make the Americans pay dearly. Every man will kill 10 of the enemy before dying." Kuribayashi's preparations reflected a grim awareness of reality. Japanese intelligence estimated that the United States could field over 1,000 ships for the assault, supported by hundreds of aircraft. The defenders of Iwo Jima numbered only about 21,000. Kuribayashi knew the math. He also knew that the Americans would bring their terrifying machine of coordination to bear. His only hope was to design defenses that could disrupt, delay, and complicate that coordination long enough to matter. As the tunnels expanded and the bunkers were reinforced, Kuribayashi drilled his men not in glorious charges, but in patience and discipline. He told them, "Do not fire until you see the whites of their eyes. Do not waste ammunition. Every bullet must count." His doctrine was defensive coordination, a grim mirror to the American system he had studied so closely. The Japanese soldiers on Iwo Jima respected him, even as they feared the inevitability of death. Letters recovered after the war reveal a mixture of dread and fatalism. One private wrote to his parents, "Our commander tells us that we will not return. He tells us to be proud, for our sacrifice will shake the Americans. I do not fear death, but I wonder if it will matter." February 19th, 1945. The black sands of Iwo Jima awaited the largest amphibious assault yet launched in the Pacific. Admiral Chester Nimitz commanded an armada of over 800 ships. The force included nearly 70,000 Marines from the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions, supported by naval gunfire, carrier aircraft, and the full weight of American logistics. For 3 days prior to the landing, the island had been bombarded by battleships and cruisers. More than 20,000 shells crashed into the volcanic rock. Naval gunners reported targets obliterated. American commanders believed the Japanese defenders must surely have been annihilated. But when the first wave of Marines waded ashore on the morning of the 19th, silence greeted them. Then, As the beach filled with men and machines, the island erupted. Hidden bunkers opened fire. Artillery, concealed in caves, unleashed devastating barrages. Machine guns swept the beaches in interlocking arcs. Mortars dropped with deadly precision. Within minutes, the landing zone became a slaughterhouse. Kuribayashi's strategy had worked. By withholding fire until the beaches were crowded, he maximized American casualties. The Marines, pinned on the soft volcanic sand, struggled to move under the weight of their gear. Tanks bogged down in the ash. Landing craft piled up, blocking each other in the surf. For the first time since Tarawa, American coordination faltered under the sheer intensity of Japanese fire. But even in that inferno, the machine adapted. Forward observers called in naval gunfire that shifted with lethal accuracy. Carrier aircraft swooped in, bombing Japanese bunkers identified by tracer fire. Engineers crawled forward under fire to blast pillboxes with satchel charges. Tank crews coordinated with infantry, providing cover as Marines inched inland. The battle became one of attrition, fought yard by yard. The Americans moved slowly but relentlessly, each unit supported by the vast network of coordination that had been honed through previous battles. Radios crackled with updates, directing artillery, aircraft, and armor with precision. Supplies flowed from offshore ships to the front lines through a logistical chain that defied the chaos of combat. Japanese counterattacks, when they came, were annihilated by coordinated responses. Naval gunfire adjusted in real time, cutting down advancing formations. Artillery and mortars worked in tandem with airstrikes. Night attacks, once the pride of Japanese infantry, were shredded by radar-guided defensive fire and perfectly timed illumination rounds. Kuribayashi's men fought with bravery beyond measure, but every tactic they employed was met by an American response executed with mechanical precision. For 36 days, the battle raged. The cost was horrific. Nearly 7,000 Marines were killed, and over 20,000 wounded. The Japanese garrison of 21,000 was almost entirely annihilated. Only about 200 survived, most of them unconscious or gravely wounded when captured. The flag raising on Mount Suribachi, on February 23rd, became the most iconic image of the Pacific War. But behind that moment lay unimaginable suffering. Kuribayashi himself fought until the end, leading a final desperate attack on March 25th. His body was never found. His last letters spoke of honor, duty, and the hope that his sacrifice had bought time for the homeland. Yet in truth, Iwo Jima revealed the futility of resistance. American coordination, though strained, had once again triumphed. The machine had absorbed the shock of Kuribayashi's defenses and continued forward. The price was high, but the momentum was unstoppable. For Japan, the realization was devastating. If even Iwo Jima fortified, defended by fanatics, commanded by one of their finest generals could not stop the Americans, then what hope remained? April 1st, 1945. The waters off Okinawa shimmered under a pale spring sun, but the sight that greeted Japanese lookouts was anything but peaceful. Stretching across the horizon lay the largest amphibious assault force ever assembled in the Pacific. More than 1,300 American ships, carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports filled the sea like a forest of steel. For the Japanese defenders on the island, it was as though the ocean itself had turned into an enemy. Okinawa was the gateway to Japan's home islands. Barely 400 miles from Kyushu, it was the last great obstacle before the Americans could launch their final assault. General Mitsuru Ushijima, commander of the Japanese 32nd Army, knew the stakes. More than 100,000 Japanese soldiers, reinforced by conscripted Okinawan civilians, awaited the storm. They built defenses in caves, ridges, and hills, determined to make the Americans pay in blood for every foot of ground. Yet as the first waves approached, what struck many observers was not just the size of the American fleet, but its precision. Amphibious doctrine, refined through years of bitter combat, had reached its zenith. Battleships opened fire at exactly the designated moment, their guns pounding shore defenses in carefully timed patterns. Carrier aircraft swept the skies, strafing strongpoints identified by aerial reconnaissance. Landing craft lowered into the water in coordinated waves, each carrying its assigned mix of infantry, engineers, and equipment. It was the Guadalcanal spectacle, magnified tenfold. The Japanese plan for Okinawa was grimly realistic. Unlike earlier battles, there would be no attempt to stop the landings on the beaches. Ushijima and his chief of staff, General Izumu Cho, knew the Americans' coordination would shred any counterattack in the surf. Instead, they adopted Kuribayashi's doctrine, defense in depth. Let the Americans land unopposed, then bleed them dry in the hills and ridges inland. The beaches fell quickly, almost too easily. By the end of the first day, more than 60,000 Marines and soldiers had landed with relatively light casualties. Observers noted the eerie silence from Japanese guns. Some feared a trap. But as American columns moved inland toward Shuri Castle, the Japanese unleashed their fury. From concealed caves and bunkers, artillery and mortars poured fire on advancing troops. Machine guns raked the slopes. Snipers waited patiently in trees and ruins. The Americans responded with their now familiar symphony of coordination, naval gunfire, called in by forward observers, airstrikes directed in real time, tanks and infantry moving in tandem. Every Japanese strongpoint destroyed was mapped, reported, and replaced with overlapping fields of American firepower. The battle became a nightmare of attrition. For 82 days, Okinawa consumed men and machines like no other battle in the Pacific. The Americans faced not just soldiers, but civilians pressed into service. Women carried ammunition. Children acted as lookouts. Entire families died in mass suicides, driven by Japanese propaganda that painted the Americans as monsters. Coordination once again proved decisive. When weather grounded aircraft, naval guns filled the gap. When supply lines were threatened, transport ships maneuvered with clockwork precision to deliver reinforcements. Radar directed defensive screens against kamikaze attacks, integrating destroyers, carriers, and fighter patrols in a system that blunted Japan's last desperate weapon. But the cost was staggering. The Americans suffered over 12,000 dead and nearly 50,000 wounded. Japanese losses were catastrophic. More than 100,000 soldiers killed, along with tens of thousands of civilians. Villages were obliterated, hills reduced to rubble, the once lush island transformed into a moonscape of craters and corpses. For the Japanese High Command, Okinawa was confirmation of their worst fears. Even when fighting on terrain designed for defense, even when employing the most fanatical resistance, American coordination overwhelmed them. Every counterattack was anticipated. Every breakthrough was crushed by the seamless integration of land, sea, and air power. Okinawa was not just a battle, it was a rehearsal for the invasion of Japan itself. And it convinced many leaders, including Emperor Hirohito, that such an invasion would mean national suicide. Behind the spectacle of Okinawa's relentless waves lay the true engine of American power: industry. The ability to coordinate massive assaults across thousands of miles of ocean did not emerge by chance. It was built in the factories of Detroit, the shipyards of California, the steel mills of Pittsburgh, and the training grounds spread across the continent. During the war, the United States launched more than 100,000 aircraft, 120,000 tanks, and over 5,000 naval vessels of every size. Liberty ships, built in assembly line fashion, carried supplies across the oceans at a rate Japan could never match. Higgins boats, the small landing craft that delivered men to beaches, rolled off production lines by the tens of thousands. LVTs, once dismissed as ungainly experiments, became indispensable for crossing reefs and shallow waters. But numbers alone did not create coordination. What mattered was standardization. Every landing craft was built to the same specifications. Every radio followed the same frequencies. Every division trained with the same manuals. This allowed units from different services, Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, to plug into the same system without chaos. A Marine radio operator could call in support from an Army artillery battery or a Navy destroyer without translation or delay. The machine worked because every part had been designed to fit together. Japanese officers marveled and despaired at this industrial coordination. While Japan struggled with shortages of fuel, ammunition, and even food, the Americans seemed inexhaustible. Damaged ships returned to Pearl Harbor or San Francisco, repaired in weeks and sent back into combat. Pilots shot down 1 month, returned with new aircraft the next. Infantry divisions rotated through training and rest, always replenished by the vast manpower of the American heartland. One Japanese officer, captured at Okinawa, confessed, "We thought we were fighting men, but we are fighting a factory. Every time we destroy one machine, 10 more appear." The scale of American logistics was staggering. During the Okinawa campaign alone, U.S. forces consumed more than 600,000 artillery shells, 2 million mortar rounds, and 100,000 tons of supplies. Every bullet, every shell, every meal had to be delivered across thousands of miles of ocean, and yet it arrived on schedule. Ships unloaded in predetermined zones. Trucks rolled off in sequence. Depots were established behind the front lines within hours. The battlefield functioned like a factory floor, each process feeding into the next. This industrial war machine transformed coordination from theory into reality. Without it, the synchronized landings at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa would have been impossible. With it, the Americans achieved something unprecedented: the ability to project overwhelming force, precisely coordinated, across the largest ocean on Earth. For Japan, the realization was devastating. Their empire had been built on speed, surprise, and the warrior spirit. But against the American machine, spirit was not enough. No amount of bravery could overcome the relentless tide of ships, planes, and men, all moving with mechanical precision. Okinawa proved that even the most determined resistance could not withstand the combined weight of industrial power and perfected coordination. By the summer of 1945, Japanese leaders faced an impossible choice: fight to the death against an enemy that had mastered the art of modern war, or surrender and preserve what remained of their nation. The answer would come soon, not on a beach, but in the skies over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yet the foundations of Japan's defeat had already been laid, wave after coordinated wave, from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. By the summer of 1944, Japanese commanders had stopped underestimating the Americans. What they now feared most was not firepower alone, nor sheer numbers, but something subtler and far more dangerous: coordination. The Americans had solved a problem that had haunted militaries for centuries: how to make ships, planes, and ground troops act as one unified organism in the chaos of battle. Historians later called it the coordination revolution. To Japanese officers, watching from bunkers and caves, it felt like sorcery. On Saipan, naval bombardments lifted at the precise second landing craft touched the beaches. At Iwo Jima, artillery fire shifted seamlessly to allow tanks and infantry to advance. At Okinawa, radar-directed defenses shredded kamikaze attacks with terrifying efficiency. The secret was not mystical. It was the result of relentless innovation. The United States had established Joint Assault Signal Companies, or JASCOs, specialized units, whose sole purpose was communication. These men carried radios, signal panels, and flares, linking Navy ships to Marine units and coordinating with aircraft overhead. For the first time in history, a destroyer offshore could adjust its fire in real time, based on the call of a lieutenant crawling through volcanic ash. Equally vital was the development of standardized doctrine. The Marine Corps' tentative manual for landing operations, first published in the 1930s, had evolved into a living guide, refined by each battle. Lessons from Guadalcanal were applied at Tarawa. Mistakes at Tarawa were corrected at Saipan. Innovations at Saipan shaped Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Every assault was both a battle and a classroom. Each mistake transformed into doctrine, each success codified into training. Technology reinforced doctrine. The proliferation of portable radios gave junior officers a voice in the grand symphony of battle. Radar provided early warning and precise coordination of air and naval assets. Amphibious vehicles, like the LVT, bridged the gap between sea and land, ensuring that coordination extended across physical barriers that had stymied earlier operations. Even logistics, often the Achilles heel of armies, became part of the coordinated system. Supply officers knew in advance when and where ammunition, food, and fuel were needed, and ships delivered with mechanical precision. The revolution reached its apex in the integration of combined arms. For the Americans, tanks no longer fought alone, infantry no longer advanced, unsupported, and aircraft no longer struck targets without ground coordination. Each element operated as part of a larger design, anticipating the movements of the others. To Japanese defenders, it felt as though the Americans always knew where to strike next, always had firepower at the critical moment, always replaced losses before they could matter. This coordination did more than win battles. It shattered Japanese morale. Soldiers emerging from caves at Saipan or bunkers on Iwo Jima described the same horror. They could not predict American movements. They could not exploit mistakes, and they could not find weaknesses. Every counterattack was anticipated. Every defense was unraveled. The Americans fought not as individuals, but as a single machine that adapted in real time. One Japanese diary, recovered after Okinawa, captured the despair. They strike from the sea, from the air, from the land. All at once. Their guns answer our guns before we can fire a second time. It is as if the entire ocean fights against us. The coordination revolution was not without cost. The complexity of these operations demanded constant communication, disciplined timing, and relentless rehearsal. Mistakes still happened, and the price was often paid in blood on the beaches. At Tarawa, misjudged tides left Marines stranded. At Iwo Jima, volcanic terrain blunted armored advances. But unlike their Japanese counterparts, the Americans learned from mistakes. They incorporated failure into their system, adapting with each battle. This adaptability made the machine stronger. By Okinawa, The coordination was so refined that Japanese commanders openly admitted their doctrines were obsolete. No amount of bravery could overcome an enemy that not only brought overwhelming firepower, but wielded it with precision and unity. For Japan, the realization was devastating. Their empire had been built on surprise, speed, and the myth of spiritual superiority. The coordination revolution proved that war in the 20th century would be won not by spirit alone, but by systems, by the ability to integrate technology, manpower, and doctrine into a seamless whole. As the Americans perfected their coordination, the Pacific War transformed into something larger than battles for islands. It became a struggle of total war, a contest not only of armies, but of nations' entire capacity to organize and endure. The United States had embraced total war from the moment of Pearl Harbor. Factories converted to war production, entire cities retooled for military output, and millions of men and women entered uniform or industrial service. Coordination on the battlefield mirrored coordination at home. Assembly lines, logistics networks, and training programs all fed into the same machine that delivered victory on the beaches of Saipan and Okinawa. Japan, by contrast, staggered under the weight of its own limitations. Its economy, already strained by years of war in China, could not match the American juggernaut. Shortages plagued every level of the military. Fuel was scarce, ammunition rationed, food increasingly scarce. The Japanese soldier was expected to compensate with spirit, discipline, and sacrifice. But by 1944, even the most devoted commanders understood spirit could not stop the tide of American coordination. Total war also meant total destruction. The same system that delivered Marines to beaches with clockwork precision also delivered bombers to Japanese cities. By the summer of 1945, American B-29 seconds incinerated Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya with coordinated firebombing campaigns. Railways, factories, and homes were consumed in firestorms that killed hundreds of thousands. The coordination revolution extended into the skies, where fleets of bombers flew in disciplined formations. Their loads dropped in patterns calculated for maximum devastation. For Japanese civilians, the war became an inescapable nightmare. Children dug trenches as air raid shelters. Women melted down pots and pans for scrap metal. Propaganda urged every citizen to prepare for the final battle on the homeland, warning that Americans would slaughter indiscriminately. Yet whispers spread whispers that the Americans, unlike the Japanese leadership, possessed an uncanny ability to organize not just armies, but entire societies for war. Some Japanese leaders clung to the hope that kamikaze attacks and homeland resistance could break American morale. At Okinawa, waves of suicide planes struck the fleet, sinking dozens of ships and killing thousands of sailors. But coordination blunted even this. Radar networks, combat air patrols, and disciplined ship formations reduced the impact of kamikazes. For every American ship sunk, hundreds remained, supported by a logistical tail that Japan could never sever. By the time of Okinawa's fall, in June 1945, the doctrine of total war was undeniable. America had mobilized every resource, integrated every service, and perfected coordination on a scale that dwarfed anything in history. Japan, once the master of amphibious warfare, had become the victim of its own underestimation. In the words of Admiral Nimitz, spoken after Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue. Yet behind the valor lay something equally decisive: the uncommon ability of an entire nation to move, fight, and endure as one. By late 1944, The Pacific War had entered a phase no Japanese strategist had dared to imagine 3 years earlier. The rising sun, once ascendant from Manchuria to the jungles of Burma, now flickered under the shadow of relentless American advances. Every island seized brought airfields closer to Tokyo. Every landing, executed with machine-like precision, tore another piece from Japan's defensive perimeter. The turning of the tide was not sudden, but unmistakable. It began with Guadalcanal, where Colonel Ichiki's shattered regiment learned that American coordination was no illusion. It continued at Tarawa, where Marines clawed their way across a reef under fire, but refused to yield. Saipan transformed doubt into despair, shattering Japan's outer line of defense and prompting the fall of Prime Minister Tojo. Iwo Jima revealed that even the strongest fortifications could not withstand the American machine, and Okinawa made clear that the war was lost. For Japanese commanders, the sense of inevitability was devastating. Diaries captured the growing realization. A naval officer wrote after Saipan, "We cannot match their system. Each ship, each aircraft, each soldier plays his part without confusion. We fight bravely but separately. They fight as one." Another, watching the bombardment of Okinawa, noted, "The sea itself is against us. The sky itself is against us. We are surrounded by a storm that never ceases." The Americans, for their part, felt the momentum shift in their bones. Soldiers and Marines, who had once feared Japanese ferocity, now spoke of inevitability. Letters home described the landings as terrible, but always moving forward. One Marine at Okinawa wrote to his wife, "It is like fighting a machine. We are cogs in it, and none of us can stop. But the machine moves, and it crushes everything ahead of it." The scale of American operations by late 1944 was staggering. The invasion of Leyte in the Philippines alone involved more than 700 ships and nearly 200,000 troops. For General Douglas MacArthur, who waded ashore proclaiming, "I have returned," it was a personal triumph. But for the Japanese, it was a catastrophe. The once proud Imperial Navy, already battered at Midway and the Philippine Sea, was shattered in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. There, coordination again proved decisive. American carrier groups struck with precision, crippling Japanese fleets that struggled with communication and fuel shortages. Radar-directed gunfire and air patrols neutralized kamikaze waves. Submarines operated in tandem with surface fleets, sealing gaps and ambushing retreating ships. The Japanese Navy ceased to exist as an effective fighting force after Leyte. From that point forward, Japan would fight alone, without the shield of its fleet. The Pacific had turned. No longer was America fighting to survive. Now it was fighting to finish. For Japan's leaders, the psychological blow was immense. Prime Minister Tojo's resignation after Saipan was more than political theater. It was an admission that Japan had misjudged its enemy completely. The myth of American weakness had collapsed. In its place loomed a nightmare, an adversary that combined industrial might, technological innovation, and coordination on a scale the world had never seen. Some Japanese officers still clung to the idea of a decisive battle, a single confrontation that might bleed America enough to force negotiation. This dream, rooted in the victory over Russia at Tsushima in 1905, was a cultural memory. But reality offered no Tsushima. The Americans did not fight for single victories. They fought for systems, processes, and momentum. Even when suffering heavy losses, as at Tarawa or Iwo Jima, they absorbed the blow, adapted, and advanced. For civilians on the home islands, the turning of the Pacific was felt in fire and hunger. Allied submarines strangled supply lines, sinking merchant ships faster than Japan could replace them. Food shortages grew severe. Rice was mixed with millet or acorns. Fish vanished from markets. Children fainted in classrooms from hunger. Air raids struck with increasing frequency, and whispers spread of the coming invasion. The machine was moving closer. By the spring of 1945, the road to victory lay open. American forces stood at the gates of Japan, their bases on Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, allowing B-29 bombers to reach the home islands. Okinawa provided the staging ground for the final blow. The question was no longer whether Japan would be defeated, but how and at what cost. For American planners, the road ahead was clear, yet terrifying. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, envisioned the largest amphibious assault in history. The first phase, Operation Olympic, would land 14 divisions on Kyushu. The second, Operation Coronet, would strike Honshu and the Kanto Plain. Estimates of American casualties ranged from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million. Japanese casualties were expected to be even higher. What made these operations conceivable at all was the proven system of coordination. Commanders believed that the same machine that had taken Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa could take Japan itself. Every lesson learned would be applied, every error corrected, every cog in the machine polished. Amphibious doctrine, once experimental, was now perfected to the point of routine. But for Japan, the prospect was apocalyptic. Military leaders urged preparation for Ketsugo, the decisive battle on the home islands. Civilians were trained to resist with bamboo spears. Schoolgirls practiced throwing themselves under tanks with satchel charges. Propaganda insisted that spirit could triumph over machines. Yet among the highest ranks, doubts grew. Reports from Okinawa made clear that American coordination rendered such hopes futile. No amount of bamboo spears could stop the tide. The road to victory, however, did not end with invasion. In July 1945, the United States tested the atomic bomb at Alamogordo, New Mexico. Suddenly, coordination was not the only revolution in warfare. Technology had leapt forward again, promising destruction on a scale unimaginable, even in the infernos of Tokyo or Dresden. When Hiroshima was bombed on August 6th, the city vanished in a single coordinated act: a bomber, an escort, a target, a weapon. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. The atomic bomb did what years of firebombing and naval blockades could not. It shocked Japan's leadership into surrender. Emperor Hirohito, in his broadcast to the nation, spoke of a new and most cruel bomb and admitted that to continue fighting would mean the ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation. Yet even the atomic bomb must be seen in the context of the coordination revolution. Without the bases secured by amphibious landings, without the logistics that delivered supplies across the Pacific, without the integration of services that made the U.S. military unstoppable, the bomb might never have been dropped. It was coordination that brought the machine to Japan's doorstep. The bomb was merely its final hammer blow. For American veterans, the road to victory was paved with sacrifice. More than 100,000 had died in the Pacific, countless others wounded. They remembered friends lost on the black sands of Iwo Jima, in the coral lagoons of Tarawa, in the jungles of Guadalcanal. For Japanese veterans, the road was lined with futility, brave charges shattered by naval gunfire, fortified caves annihilated by flamethrowers, night raids destroyed by radar-guided fire. Both sides had fought with courage, but only one had fought with a system that ensured victory. Historians today still debate the morality of the bombings, the necessity of each battle, the choices of leaders. But few dispute the central fact. The Pacific turned not because America had more men or more ships, but because it learned to make them act as one. The coordination revolution had transformed war itself. When the guns fell silent in August 1945, the Pacific was transformed. The rising sun, once blazing across Asia, now lay extinguished. The American flag flew over Tokyo Bay, as representatives of the Empire of Japan signed the instrument of surrender aboard the USS Missouri. The war was over, but its lessons endured, none more profound than the revolution of coordination. For military strategists, the Pacific Campaign rewrote the art of war. Amphibious assaults, once considered reckless gambles, became scientific operations. Naval bombardments, airstrikes, infantry landings, armored thrusts, and logistical resupply were no longer separate elements. They were parts of a single design. What Japanese officers had once dismissed as impossible had become the American way of war. In the post-war years, these lessons spread across the globe. NATO forces adopted joint doctrines, inspired by the Pacific experience. The Korean War saw American coordination tested again, most famously in General MacArthur's landing at Incheon in 1950, where tides, timing, and fire support echoed the patterns of Saipan and Okinawa. Later, conflicts from Vietnam to the Gulf War bore the imprint of amphibious manuals first drafted in the 1930s and refined in blood across the islands of the Pacific. The technological legacy was equally profound. Radios, once bulky and unreliable, became the lifeline of modern armies. Radar, perfected against kamikazes, became essential in both military and civilian aviation. Amphibious vehicles evolved into modern armored personnel carriers. And perhaps most importantly, the philosophy of interoperability. The idea that every branch of a military must be able to communicate and operate as one became a cornerstone of global defense. Strategy. For Japan, the legacy was bitter but transformative. Stripped of its empire and forbidden from rearming, Japan rebuilt itself as a peaceful nation. Yet its post-war self-defense forces, created under American guidance, quietly adopted the very doctrines that had once defeated them. Coordination, not spirit alone, became the foundation of modern Japanese defense. The irony was profound. The lessons learned in defeat became the principles of survival. For the United States, the coordination revolution shaped not just military doctrine, but national identity. The war demonstrated that democracy, when mobilized, could produce unity of purpose without authoritarian control. Factories, farmers, soldiers, sailors, and citizens acted as parts of the same machine, not by command alone, but by belief in a common cause. It was a lesson that resonated long after the war, shaping how Americans viewed themselves in the Cold War and beyond. The human legacy, however, was more complex. Survivors on both sides carried memories of horror. Marines who waded through the surf at Tarawa or crawled up the slopes of Iwo Jima remembered the smell of cordite, the screams of the wounded, the relentless grind of days without rest. Japanese soldiers who defended caves and bunkers until they were burned alive carried the weight of futility, knowing they had fought bravely, but against an enemy that could not be stopped. Civilians on Okinawa remembered the suicides, the bombardments, the endless rain of fire from sky and sea. For them, coordination was not an abstract concept. It was the rain of shells, timed to the second. It was the bombers arriving exactly as promised. It was the machine that never faltered, never hesitated, never gave them a chance to breathe. One Okinawan survivor, interviewed decades later, recalled, "The sky was filled with planes, the sea with ships. They moved together, as if controlled by a single hand. We hid in caves, but the fire always found us. It was not war between men. It was war between a nation and an island." Historians continue to debate the Pacific Campaign. Could the war have ended earlier? Were the sacrifices at Tarawa or Iwo Jima necessary? Was the atomic bomb the only way to avoid invasion? These questions remain, but one fact is beyond dispute. The coordination revolution changed everything. It demonstrated that war in the 20th century was no longer about isolated battles or individual heroics. It was about systems, processes, and integration. The Americans did not merely outfight Japan, they out-organized it. They turned chaos into order, confusion into choreography, uncertainty into routine. The legacy of coordination lives on in every modern military exercise, every multinational alliance, every joint operation where air, land, and sea forces act as one. It is the unseen inheritance of the Pacific War, born in the surf at Guadalcanal, forged in the fire of Tarawa, proven at Saipan, tested at Iwo Jima, and perfected at Okinawa. For those who lived through it, the memory remains vivid. For those who study it, the lesson is eternal. The Pacific War ended not only with the mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but with a quiet revelation. Victory belongs not just to those who fight hardest, but to those who fight together. The Americans had taken men from farms, factories, and cities, and turned them into a single instrument of war. In doing so, they redefined what modern conflict would mean for generations. On the black sands of Iwo Jima and the shattered hills of Okinawa, in the diaries of Japanese officers and the letters of American Marines, one truth shines through. Coordination was the weapon that decided the Pacific, and its legacy still shapes our world today. The Pacific War teaches us how unity can change history. Leave a comment if this story moved you. Subscribe and join us as we uncover more hidden truths of the past.